Now you'll note, although we now have two physical NICs attached to this virtual switch, the management network still only has one IP address. In vSphere, there's a logical disconnect between the IP addresses that are assigned to the management network and the physical network adapters. We don't have separate IP addresses on each of those adapters like we would in, say, a Windows operating system. In Windows, we are used to, we go into network, we right-click a particular NIC, and there's the IP addresses assigned to that NIC. If we want to assign another IP address to another NIC, that's a separate process. With vSphere, it's disconnected. The management network, these are uplinks to a virtual switch. The management network is plugged into one of the ports on that virtual switch, and it has an IP address. So we don't have separate IPs on these physical adapters. Now, I mentioned in the Get Starting course that the VMware port groups act as a wrapper for networking configurations against each virtual NIC. Now, I'll go into a little bit more depth on that now. So we'll take a look at VM network. If we take a look at edit settings here, the first thing we notice here is a VLAN ID, which is currently none or 0. All, or 4095, is similar but not the same as a trunked port on a Cisco switch, or a tagged port as it's called on some other switch vendors. What this does is it means that every packet on every virtual machine on that host will be passed to this VM as well. So it's similar to a trunk port, but not exactly the same. But for most time, you're going to want to specify a VLAN ID in there. However, for this, we're leaving that as none. On security, we've got the same options that we had on the vSphere switch configuration. And as I said, we can override it at this level. That's probably what you're going to do. It's unlikely that you're going to want to set those for the whole switch. Same with traffic shaping, you can override that there. And the teaming and failover. You're more likely to want to do this at the switch level, but there are occasions when you are going to want to override it on a per port group level. I'm now going to add another virtual machine port group to this host. I'll put it on that same switch. I'm going to just leave it as VM network 2. I'm going to leave that as VLAN ID 0. Next. Finish. There we go. Now, there's often a misunderstanding here that this is now that VMs connected to VM network 2 are going to be isolated from those on VM network 1 or just VM network. But that is not actually the case. All they are is a wrapper for the settings. It just allows us to configure multiple VMs and not have to specify things like VLAN ID, uplinks, and the like every single virtual machine. However, if the VLAN ID is left blank on both of these port groups, then they still are effectively in the same broadcast domain. They're in the same VLAN, if you like. Just as if you put two ports in a switch into the same VLAN. It's the same as well if I define two port groups and put them both in VLAN ID 2, they would still be able to communicate with each other. They are still in the same network in that sense. Okay, now I'll remove that off there as well because that was just for a demonstration. Now if we take a look at the management network, the VMkernel port group, that has mostly the same options. However, that management port group, that VMkernel port group, has within it a VMkernel port, and that has some more options on it. So let's say edit on that. So MTU, so what is the largest frame we can send across this switch? That's a networking consideration. most of the time you're going to leave that on 1500. The only exception is if you are using iSCSI, you're probably going to want to set that to an MTU of 9000 because that reduces the amount of overhead in your iSCSI traffic. And on this port group, we have a number of enabled services that we can activate for that port, for that VMkernel port. Now we'll be looking at each of these individual services separately. So I'm not going to go into these at the moment, that's where they are. We have the IPv4 settings. This is where it is the IP addresses are set. And same for IPv6.